y'all. So this is Stephanie from Spinsters in the Making blog on Weebly. And unfortunately for the first few minutes of this tutorial video, I lost some footage. But basically for the first part that you missed, I was explaining that I was making the Joy block, which is number 13 of the Sewcialites quilt along. I also am making the 9-inch block, so I needed 12, 2, and 3.5-inch rectangles of my background fabric, which is the white that you will see in this video. Then I also needed one 3.5-inch square of my print, which is a dark blue with some floral patterns on it. You also needed 4 2-inch by 3.5-inch rectangles and 16 2-inch squares. And so in this first part, I started working on the flying geese section. So I needed 8 of my 2 by 3.5-inch background rectangles plus the 16 print squares for these blocks. So the first part that was skipped is me going over how I'm going to place the squares onto the edge of the rectangles. I marked it with the fusion pin from corner to corner, and I sewed directly on the line. And then once that was done, then I pressed it open, the seam open, and then the next step that you're going to see is me putting the second grouping of squares onto the opposite side of those rectangles so that you can get the flying geese. And that's where this video will start off. So sorry about that, and hopefully this little explanation in the beginning of this video is helpful. So now I have all of my rectangles sewn on of my 8 flying geese, and so here's one of them that you can see. I've already trimmed off my edges and I have ironed them open. The seam's open right now. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm taking the rest of my rectangles of my print and lining them up from edge to edge with the line going across to make a nice point for my flying geese in the middle. So once I have these all on, I'm going to be sewing on the line, and then I will be possibly pressing them open or to the side. What I'm trying to do is prevent a big bunch of fabric being at my geese point, because that will make sewing a little more tedious and hard to make sure you have a nice straight line and have nice good points. So once I have sewn all these, trimmed off my edges and pressed it, I'll come back to you and show you how I press it to hopefully make it lie flatter for when I'm sewing my flying geese panels together. So 2 of these will get sewn together to make 4 little blocks that will then go into the rest of the Joy blocks. And I will come back once I've done those. Alright, so I have finished my flying geese, and I've sewn both of my prints on, and there's a nice triangle on all of these. For my pressing, what I did was I pressed one side open seams, and then on the other side I pressed toward the dark side. So when I sew over this area right here, it's going to not have a huge cluster of fabric, so hopefully I'll get some nice points and it'll be easier on my machine. And it'll be easier for me when I quilt this whole entire quilt. So now the final process for these flying geese is I've kind of paired them up into the 4 blocks that we're going to be making. And so you're just going to fold these down, lay it across, do a 1/4-inch seam allowance across the top here, and then we'll make some nice blocks, and that will make 4 blocks. And then once we are finished with our 4 flying geese blocks, then we're going to be moving on to our rectangular blocks. I'll be back once I've sewn those. Alright, so I have taken my blocks and I have sewn them all together. And for the ironing, I actually ironed up towards the white triangle, sorry. And that way it'll lay nice and flat when I do sew and quilt over it. There's no bunching at the point here, which is really nice, and it just lays a lot flatter. And I've done that with all of these, so they're all being ironed up this way, this way, this way, where the points are going. So now that I have these 4 blocks done, I can set them aside and we can just work on our rectangle blocks. So these are your C and A fabrics. A is your background, C is your print, and they are the 2 by 3.5-inch rectangles. And you're just going to pair them up, one background with one print. And then you're going to sew with a 1/4-inch seam allowance on all of these. And then you will have your rectangular blocks that will go into this final block.
So once again, I'm going to fold this down, place it on top, good fabric sides together, do a 1/4 inch seam allowance across the top, and then I will press towards the dark side on these fabric blocks, and then once we have those complete, I'll come back to you and we can actually lay out the final layout of the block. Alright, so I have sewn my rectangular blocks here. They are all pressed to the dark side fabric, just so that it doesn't show up. And now that we have our flying geese, our rectangular blocks, and then we have our middle center block, we can now actually lay out the joy block. So you're going to take block B, which is your 3.5 inch square, place it in the middle, and then you're going to want to have your A, which is your backgrounds rectangles, pointed in towards your middle square. So it's going to look like this. So those are your rectangles, and then you're going to be taking your flying geese, and your background geese are going to kind of be going in a rotational clockwise pattern. So this one's going to point this way. This one is going to point downwards. This one's going to be pointing to the left. And then this one will be pointing upwards, so it makes a nice circular pattern like this. So now that we have it laid out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be sewing across and get these 3 strips sewn together with a 4th inch seam allowance. I will probably be pressing these seams open, but I will let you know once I have sewn them and see which way it lies flatter. So I will come back to you once I've sewn all these together. I'll show you how I've pressed them, and then we'll be flipping these panels down, sewing with a 4th inch seam allowance across to make the final block. So I'll see you in a little bit. Alright, so I have finished sewing my panels, and what I've done is for the middle block I have ironed in towards my dark print center block, and then on the outside, on my top and bottoms, I've pressed out towards my flying geese. And because the way I pressed them before, it isn't actually going to be such a huge bulky factor there. Like, I think my machine will be able to quilt that just fine with a hopping foot. And so those are nicely pressed. Again, this one is also pressed out towards the flying geese. So now I can actually lock these points together, pin it, and sew with a 4th inch seam allowance to hopefully get some nice connector points here and here. So I will come back to you once I've done that, and we'll see the finished block. Alright, so here is the finished joy block. It's number 13 for the Sewcialites quilt along. And so for the back, where I have ironed, I actually ironed these 2 seams open just so that they lie a little flat. And just remember, it looks like my flying geese is cut off up here, but remember these are going to be sewn all together with a 4th inch seam allowance, so those will go away and you'll have a nice little triangle once you've done it. So far the points are looking pretty good. Nothing's really cut off, which is nice. And I thought this was a really nice block. So hopefully you found this tutorial informative. And if you enjoyed this, please like and subscribe to my channel, and I will hopefully be posting more blocks once we get past the holiday break. I believe the Sewcialites are postponing release of some blocks until after the holidays. So everybody, happy holidays, and I look forward to seeing you guys later.